Okay. So tonight, Gabriel Foley, as you all know, is an avid birder from the Prairie province of Saskatchewan, Canada, while at the University of Regina, or is it Regina? I don't know. He researched nighthawk habitat use in Canada's boreal forest. Then he studied white-browed sparrow weaver nest building behavior, not in Canada, but at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. He has worked on research projects in Alaska, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nunavut, and coordinated Saskatchewan's nightjar surveys. He also hosted a weekly nature radio show, The Prairie Naturalist. And of course, now he's the coordinator of our Maryland and DC breeding bird atlas, and the third one. And he will tell us how things went last year and what to expect for the next year. So thank you very much, Gabriel.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here and to tell you about how Montgomery County has been going. In the last year, I had big plans to get out and around the state and do some atlasing, and I don't know if I submitted a checklist for the atlas from anywhere except Montgomery County. I pretty much just stuck to, well, really just to a couple of blocks. I barely even got around the county. I don't need to tell you guys, everyone knows it was quite a wacky year. But we have some really exciting results from the atlas. So first, I'll just give you a background on what the atlas is, in case you aren't familiar with it. The Maryland and DC Breeding Bird Atlas is the third time that this project has been run in the region. The first one was back in the 80s, then there was one in the mid-2000s, and now we're doing this one from 2020 to 2024. So it runs for 5 years. There's a space of about 20 years between each atlas, and this lets you compare changes over time. We can look at the distribution, the abundance, and the timing of all the birds that breed within our region. And we do this by overlaying Maryland and DC with this block grid that you see up here in the right-hand corner. The grid is a block grid. It's about 1,300 3 by 3 mile blocks. And over the course of the 5 years of the project, observers go into every single block and document all the birds that they're able to find. So you're really getting into every nook and cranny of the region to find breeding birds. It's a project unlike anything else that exists. It's pretty exciting stuff. The data that are collected can be used to document population changes, specifically related to how distribution is changing, but also with respect to relative abundance, how many birds are out there relative to each other. We can identify areas that are important for birds, whether that's areas that are important for a lot of birds or a lot of different birds, or maybe for rare birds, and identify species at risk. The data from the last 2 atlases were used to inform the state wildlife action plan here in Maryland, and also to help identify important bird areas. So when observers go out and they find birds, they use the birds' behaviors to put them into one of 4 different breeding statuses. So this, you can see I've got them listed here: observed, possible, probable, or confirmed. Those are all just going from, observed, which means you just saw a bird, all the way up to a confirmed breeding bird, which means that you found something related to nesting. And behavior codes are used to determine which one of these statuses a given bird falls into. If you just see a bird in the right habitat or it's singing, that's a possible status. And these are all 1 or 2 letter codes for the different behaviors. Examples of the middle breeding status, probable, that's things like a bird that's singing for a week or more, S7, a pair, P, or visiting a probable nest site, code N. And I'm sure that I'm telling everyone here things that they already know as you Atlas, you become pretty familiar with a lot of these codes. Most confirmed codes are 2 letters, things like carrying food, CF, carrying nesting material, CN, or nest with eggs. To collect the data, we use the eBird platform. And I think pretty much everybody here is likely familiar with eBird. It's a community science platform that millions of birders worldwide use to record their bird observations. It works really well for an atlas because it also records your precise location and how long you were actually out atlasing for. You can also record the abundance of the birds that you saw, and each checklist that you should submit can be a complete checklist, which just means that you reported all of the birds that you were able to identify. And that helps in the analysis later on because it means that we know that there weren't birds that were left off of the list. One of the important things about atlasing, and particularly with using eBird, is to stay within block boundaries. It can be easy to forget when you're using eBird to cross block boundaries. And this is something that I will probably remind atlasers of every time that I see them, because it's one of the things that's right now that we're not really able to check for. Most other things, we have a check in place to see if atlasers are, following the methods more or less the way we're expecting. But we can't really do that with block boundaries unless a checklist is very, very long. So it just comes down to reminding. Now, how do you find block boundaries? If you're using the app, it's really easy. While you're making a checklist, just tap up in the top left, the distance or the time that has elapsed. That'll bring up a map, it'll show you the grid, and it'll show where you are in relation to the grid. If you don't use the app, then you just have to do it old school with a paper map. The other thing that is new with this atlas compared to previous atlases is that all of the observations are, they're completely independent of each other. In the past, you would just try and get each species to the highest breeding code for a block that you could, and then you would forget about the species for the most part. And this time instead, we would rather, when you're doing a checklist, that you submit breeding codes every time that you see a breeding behavior. You don't have to do this, but it's better if you do for us, because we're then able to use all of the codes that you submit over time, and we're able to look and see how a whole population of birds, what the timing of their breeding is. When do they start singing? When do they start pairing up? When are they incubating? All that kind of stuff. That only happens if we get many codes over the course of a season. Okay, so I've given you the background. Now we can move into some of the preliminary results from this past year. So that what I'm about to show you here is checklists that have been submitted to the Atlas portal. I think most folks are probably familiar with the portal by now. If you have used eBird for general birding, then you just go to ebird.org. You just use the app as normal. If you're doing it for Atlas purposes, then you have to switch the portal over. And all that the portal is a label that gets attached to your checklist that lets us know that, hey, I was following the Atlas methods when I submitted this checklist. So we don't use any checklists that aren't submitted to the Atlas portal. If you don't know how to change the portals, there's instructions in the back of the handbook with screenshots. All of the checklists here are between January 1st, 2020 and October 31st. And we've defined like Atlas checklists as checklists that contain at least one breeding code or are nocturnal. So the only thing in here that isn't included that should be is 0 count checklists, which means a lot of nocturnal lists. For some reason, those aren't included in the general eBird download. You have to specifically request that, which I just learned recently. So still waiting on my data request for those. So here's the amount of atlasing effort for each region in Maryland and DC. The number of hours are here on the side, and counties or regions, since we have DC, are down below on the x-axis. And so the coded checklists, those are what I just described to you. Those are the ones that have at least one breeding code, were submitted to the Atlas portal, or are nocturnal checklists. And you can see that the proportion of coded checklists to non-coded checklists, so that's everything else that got submitted to eBird over the same time period, it's quite high. In fact, this is the highest proportion by a lot of any eBird Atlas project. This just means that Maryland Atlasers really like atlasing. And it's really exciting. Now, you will also notice that Montgomery County is quite high in comparison to the other counties. We have more birding effort and more atlasing effort by a long shot than everywhere else. So well done and congratulations. It's quite a feat. Now, of course, there are more people here. There are more atlasers doing it, but still, it's pretty impressive. Now you can see that there are other places that could really use a lift moving forward. We have a lot of folks atlasing in Montgomery County and neighboring Howard County. So if we are able to move further afield moving forward, you know, Kent, Caroline counties, Wicomico, it's another one. These are all spots that could really benefit from some traveling. Now, travel is a little bit difficult right now, to say the least. So atlasing at home is perfectly acceptable. There's nothing wrong with it. You can't atlas too much, but it is really helpful if you can get out further afield. Okay, so this is the same thing, basically, just applied spatially. This is a map of where all of the effort in Maryland and DC has gone. It's been capped at 100 hours. You can see here on the legend. So the bright blue, I mean, some of these blocks have hundreds of hours in them. But in general, you can see that where the most atlasing effort is pretty much where people live or where there happen to be quite a lot of species, like out here in Garrett County. There's also, you'll see some blank spaces. Some of these, this is the Aberdeen Proving Grounds up here where, you know, we don't have access or just water. Some of these blocks just, you know, have the tiniest little sliver of land. But then there's other spots where, like in Caroline County, where there just haven't been anyone visiting them yet. I strongly suspect that by next year, this map will be quite well filled in. If we compare this to the last atlas, you can see that we're in really good shape for having only completed a single year of the atlas. Now, one thing to know, comparing these two maps, it's not perfect. The second atlas, they didn't have the advantage of eBird recording, you know, every second of atlasing effort. So there were a lot more than 61,000 hours of effort that went into that effort, but 61,000 hours is what was recorded, and we're well over half that already, which is really impressive, and you should be really proud of yourself. So you can see that in the last atlas here, a lot of the effort, it still wasn't as evenly distributed as you might hope for. All of the minimum requirements were met for all the blocks, which is, I mean, that's what you want. But it would be awesome, I think, if this time we were able to smooth out the color contrast across the whole region. Here's a similar map. This is looking at how many species were found in each block across the whole region. Obviously, you see the same pattern with blank blocks. If no one atlas there, well, then no species were recorded. But you also see that it doesn't take a whole lot of atlasing effort to get a pretty decent species list for a block. We've set a goal for 20 hours of effort for each block. And the reason why we picked 20 hours is because after 20 hours of effort in a block, you've found about 85% or so of the species that are there. And to get up to 90% of the species, it takes you at least another 20 hours to get there. So 20 hours is really, a good bang for your buck. We can compare it to the last atlas. You will notice that the scales are not quite the same, but they're very close. And you can see that in spite of the effort differences that I was talking about earlier during the second atlas, the species richness is pretty well spread out across the whole region. You do see, obviously, there are some areas where there just are more birds breeding, like in Western Maryland, more species there. And you do see some areas where the extra effort, probably atlasers did find 100% of species breeding in Howard County. But overall, 20 hours of atlasing went into every block, and you can see that really spread that species richness out across the whole region. Now, I'm showing you the distribution map of American robin here because this is the most widely distributed, most often confirmed species that we have here. And you can see that, the maps are pretty much the same from both previous atlases here. This is the first atlas up in the top, and this is the second atlas down at the bottom here. They were found pretty much everywhere. Now, you can see here that in 2020, even though our coverage map, the map of all the effort that has gone in, is much more filled in than this, we barely have any blank blocks anywhere. There's still quite a number of blocks that don't have robins recorded with a breeding code at all. This is possible, probable, and confirmed, all lumped together. The green squares, the green blocks are where they've been observed. And so you can see that, even in Montgomery County, we've still got quite a number of blocks where robins haven't had a breeding code put on them. And I think that the reason for this is because when you're out and about atlasing, it's really easy to focus on either conformations. If you find a robin with a nest, well, you're pretty likely to code that, or you focus on finding the interesting or harder to locate birds, and so it's easy to overlook the common stuff. And then we kind of get really widespread birds like robins. We get them with a map looking like this. Now, this is not a problem at all. We've got 4 years still to go. This is an incredible start. This is much better than I was anticipating from our first year. But this is a good example of why it's important, if you're able to, when you're atlasing, to put a breeding code down even on common birds, because it can be easy to overlook them. Now, one of the really exciting things that we had in 2020 was a new breeding bird for Maryland and DC, white ibis. There was a nest with chicks found down in Somerset County, I think in early June. It's been suspected for a while that white ibises were nesting somewhere down there, but nobody had found it. And Daniel Jonathan Irons and a couple of other young guys went down and found it on an island there. We've also had not new breeding species for the region, but new for the atlas. They haven't been recorded on previous atlases. We had Mississippi kite in Calvert County, Merlin in Allegheny and Garrett County, and sandhill crane in Garrett County. All pretty exciting. So looking forward to 2021, where is the best place to put your effort? Nocturnal effort. This is probably going to be the most difficult thing that we have to accomplish for the Atlas. Atlasing at night, it's just harder. You have to stay up later, it's dark out, there's safety issues, and there's just not as many birds around. So getting out and actually, putting in some nocturnal effort is a challenge. This is the time of year right now when nocturnal effort is especially useful, up for the next couple months or so. Getting owls, great horned, barred, and screech owls. They're quite widespread, and putting in an hour of effort into each block, that's about the goal that we're aiming for. Specifically to try and get owls, but also nightjars and rails. Now, for resources that you have, I think most of you are probably familiar with these things, but if you go to this web address, there is a document there. It's a PDF that has links to every resource that has been created for the Atlas. So if you get that PDF and you save it somewhere, you have really easy, simple access to get anything that you need. I know that, remembering where things are on the website and that kind of thing can be a little challenging sometimes. So everything's right there in that PDF. You just have to click on the labels. Some of the things that I'd particularly draw your attention to in terms of being really useful is the block species list. That's what's pictured down here in the bottom right. There's actually research that has shown that atlasers who use the species list from a previous atlas, they find more species than atlasers who just go in without having consulted the list. And that makes sense, right? Because if you look at the previous one, at the list from the previous atlas, and you see that there was a Kentucky warbler, well, now you're probably going to put in a little more effort to find a Kentucky warbler. And maybe the habitat's gone, maybe the Kentucky warbler isn't there anymore, but you're more likely to have put in a bit of effort to try and find it. So I would really encourage you to make use of those. Those exist for every block. And the easiest way to get to them is through that PDF that I just described. We also have a breeding timeline, which I think is a little bit easier to use than the safe dates. It is a visual representation of the nesting period for each species of bird that breeds here, as well as their migration or dispersal time. So you can really see how the breeding season for a bird overlaps with migration. And that's not as obvious with the safe dates. Safe dates are just the time of year, typically starting in the spring and ending in the fall, when that species isn't migrating through the region anymore. And so it's safe to count them as breeding if you just happen to see an individual. If you haven't read the handbook, strongly would recommend doing that. There's a lot of details in there about different atlasing techniques or methods. And if you have questions, by all means, feel free to email or call me. But there's a good chance that the answer is in the handbook. And the newsletter. This goes out monthly, and I think one of the most useful things, or at least the thing that I try to make most useful about the newsletter, is the species summary. I try and do a deep dive on one species a month and really try and pull up all of the information that I can find that seems like it's useful for atlasing, for learning about its habitat, breeding biology, things like that, things that will help you find more of that species. The other thing that I'll say is that probable codes are really important moving forward. Confirmations are great, but your emphasis as an observer should be more on finding probable codes than on confirming things. And the reason is just because finding confirmed codes tends to take a lot more time. You're more efficient if you can find, if you focus on finding probable codes. And as you do that, you will find confirmations along the way. When you're deciding whether or not to spend more time locally or whether to go further afield, you can use the completion targets to guide you. Blocks will be marked complete as we move along, but that hasn't happened yet. So the completion targets, just as a broad overview, are the number of species that have been recorded in the block. We're aiming for 70 species across the board. The average from the last atlas was 75 species. So got some wiggle room there. If it's an urban or very agricultural block, or a very small one, we have dropped that goal down to 40. I already went over the effort, 20 hours for daytime, 1 hour for nocturnal. And then the proportion of breeding codes. We're looking for no more than 25% possible, because possible codes really don't tell you that much. It's just a bird that was in the right habitat at the right time of year, or that was singing. And we're looking for at least 25% confirmed, because if you can hit that mark, it means that some time seriously atlasing was spent in the block. But that leaves half of your codes to be probable codes, which is quite a nice, comfortable buffer. You should also try and make sure that you get into your block at all seasons when there's breeding birds. So you want to make sure that you're getting your owls while they're calling. So, late winter, and goldfinches, waxwings, late summer. And then you want to make sure that you're hitting up all of the different habitat types that are in the block as well. And the previous species lists from the last atlases, those will really help you in figuring out if you've missed any habitat types, because if you've missed a habitat, then you've probably missed a group of birds on that list. Okay, so I'm going to go over a few tips moving into the nesting season, things to think about, keep in mind. Hopefully they help. The most important thing, and it seems so silly to say because everybody's like, well, yes, of course, but really the most important thing is to just be patient and move really slowly. Pay attention to what's going around. If you are watching birds, then you will find breeding evidence. birds, especially during peak breeding season. We've got dozens of species that migrate up here with the express purpose of building a nest and raising young and going back down south. They are here on a mission and they just want to raise those chicks, and that is all that they're doing here. So their behavior is completely centered around that reproduction. It does really help if you know more about each species, the kind of habitat that they prefer. Do they nest on the ground? Do they nest up in a tree? Are they a cavity nester? That kind of thing. Nesting information can be a little bit harder to find than just regular, identification resources or things. But Googling, as silly as that sounds, Googling is one of the most useful resources. There are also a couple of books that you can buy that are pretty good for nest or egg identification. But the internet has some great resources. Another thing to keep in mind is that migrants tend to arrive here on a schedule, and they tend to start nesting at about the same time every year, more or less. But resident birds are more variable. And particularly, when you have a mild winter like this year, you want to be aware that nesting can be happening earlier than you might expect. You may have seen that there was a gosling that was photographed from Montgomery County about a week ago. That means that those geese started incubating that egg in at least early December, which is just mind-blowing. What are they thinking? You also want to pay attention to females. Males are easier to spot. They're louder, but in most of the songbirds, females do most of the work around the actual nest, building it, incubating it. So if you're paying attention to females, you're more likely to get the confirmations. Now males, excellent for getting code S7. If you hear a male and come back a week later and can get what you believe to be that same male singing there, it means he's on territory. That's one of the easiest probable codes to get. When you are following one bird to see where it's going or what it's doing, it can be really tempting to have a better one, coming along that seems to be doing something more interesting. But don't be distracted. Stick with the bird that you are already on. If you try and keep switching to different birds, you won't actually get to your end goal. Whereas if you stick with one, you are much more likely to get a good code out of it. You also want to check all birds with binoculars, whether it's for food that they're carrying or for nesting material. You can see in this picture, this yellow warbler's got stuff in his bill. That seems pretty obvious, but a lot of these small birds use spider web, which can just be a little like white speck on the bill and really easy to miss, even easy to miss something obvious like this. But check birds with binoculars and look at the bill. Another thing that you can do is to sit near potential nest material earlier in the nesting season. Birds have to build their nests, and especially for the lining, they'll be looking for something softer, like thistle or cattail down or fine grasses, even used nests from previous years. One thing that some folks will do is they'll put out a suet feeder and they'll fill it with useful nesting material. That can be a really easy way to get confirmations. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about finding nests and some tips on doing that. It's challenging and frustrating a lot of times to find nests, especially consistently. And that's why it's better to focus on finding probable codes. But finding nests is just fun. It's so rewarding. And I think it's one of the most rewarding things to me about atlasing. So I'm going to go over ways that will help you with this. Some things are more subtle than others. The more subtle things, less useful, but the difficulty of finding nests really depends on the stage that the nest is in. During the egg laying stage, which for most songbirds is, 3 to 5 days, they tend to lay an egg a day and start incubating once they've laid all their eggs. They're only visiting their nest like once or twice a day. And so that can be a really tough time to find the nest. Gets a little bit easier during incubation, but not by much. The female is pretty much sitting on her nest almost all day long. She'll leave about every half hour or so for 5 or 10 minutes. During nest building, tends to be the female in general who does most of the nest building. That's not a rule, that just is a general theme. But during the nestling stage, this is the easiest time because both parents, all that they're doing is feeding a nest full of chicks, and they're just flying back and forth, taking fecal sacs out, bringing food in. That's their life for 2 weeks. If you find songbirds, most of these things apply to forest songbirds. So if you find a pair of songbirds copulating, that is obviously code C, and that's great. But most songbirds, they tend to copulate pretty near the nest. Often it is in the same tree as the nest, maybe the one over. Often it's even on the same branch. So if you see a copulation, check carefully around where those birds are, and you might be lucky and find the nest. You also want to be aware of birds that are repeatedly entering kind of the same substrate over and over. Now, this can be useful for finding nests, but really this is an overlooked way to get code N, visiting a probable nest site. You don't necessarily have to see the bird actually going to the specific nest site. Once you kind of learn how to recognize that repeated entry behavior, it can become apparent when a bird is moving in and out of a nest area. And this can be great for skulky species, where you really, you can't easily find the nest at all. One thing to be aware of, though, is that often the birds will go into a substrate and then they will be quite sneaky and move further along, get to their actual nest site, and then come back out the same way. So it might look like they're nesting right here, and no matter how hard you look, you can't find the nest there. They're actually back here, and they're just using that point of entry and exit regularly. You also want to be on the lookout for nervous birds. Code A isn't just, it's agitated. That's not just chasing predators away. That is, if you see a bird that is bouncing around in a tree and it is chipping a lot, that's a great indication of a nest nearby. And that is perfect code A. Even when they're not agitated, adult birds tend to look at their nest site, just kind of check on it. Most of these songbirds, they don't have very large territories, and so they're often keeping an eye on things. Now, this is not a behavior that is it's not very obvious, but especially if they are agitated, they will start to look at the nest more, and sometimes you can cue in on where the nest is based on where they're looking. At some point, you may notice that females kind of seem to disappear, and that is a good indication that incubation for that species has begun. Each species tends more or less to kind of have the same timing happen, so they'll generally start building their nest at the same time, laying their eggs at the same time, incubating at the same time. And different species will have different schedules, but the same species will kind of be on the same schedule. So if all of a sudden it seems like all of the the females have disappeared of a species, that's a good indication that incubation has begun. And that's useful because if you do find a female, you should stick with her and follow her, because she's going to go back to the nest within 5 or 10 minutes. They don't spend very long off their nest when they're incubating, unless, of course, they're one of the taxa like woodpeckers or wrens or vireos that do have males that will incubate as well. But most songbirds, it's just the females. So if you find one, follow her and she'll probably lead you to the nest. Just make sure to give her space, because especially females, they can be pretty antsy. They do tend to feed a little faster when they're incubating as well than when they're egg laying. They seem more relaxed during the egg laying period, but that's a pretty subtle thing. Another thing to look or listen for, I guess. Another thing to listen for is frequent chipping. Females of a lot of species will chip just before and just after they leave the nest, and so of course that is an indication that you've got a bird, but it can also indicate that she's quite close to a nest. And males will often respond to this chipping by coming in either guarding the nest itself, so they'll be quite close to where the nest is, or they'll guard the female. If they're following the female around, that's obviously guarding the female, not the nest. Males will also often get a favorite singing perch that they can see the nest from. And sometimes you can see them kind of looking in the direction of the nest as they're singing. They like to keep an eye on the female and what she's up to. Birds may be socially monogamous, but they're certainly not actually monogamous. So he tries to keep an eye on any intruders in his territory. When it comes to the nestling period, and both sexes are going and they're feeding their chicks, it can be easier to follow males to a nest because they tend to be less cautious than the females. Now, having said all of that about woodland songbirds, grassland nests are a little bit different. They can be really challenging. If you are walking through a grassland, one of the ways that you can find birds finding the nest, but also getting a code on a bird is when they flush right at your feet. This is like, I'm talking like right at your feet, like within one step. If that happens, then you do have a nest right there. Birds might flush in grasslands for, they might be foraging there, they might be preening, but in those situations, they will flush further away. They never let you get that close. So if you've got a bird that flushed right at your feet, that is an excellent opportunity to use code N. There's no problem at all with using code N. You can look for the nest, but you need to be very careful. You don't want to step around a lot. In fact, you shouldn't even move your feet. You can just look down from where the bird flushed from, and you want to be pretty quick about it. Now, in grasslands, adults often approach their nest on the ground. So even though you can watch and you can see what birds are doing, and watching an area for half an hour can give you a pretty good picture of where everyone's territories is and where likely nests are and that kind of thing. When you're walking through and you've got a bird that flushes 3 to 15 feet ish away, that's not a good place for you to use code N, but you may also have a nest there. And a lot of grassland birds will actually run away from their nest before they fly up, particularly species where the males warn the females that you're coming, like red-winged blackbirds will do this, dick thistles, bobolinks. And so if you've got that sort of situation, what you can do is you can see where the bird flushed from. And you can go up there, watching where you step, and you can look at the flush site and then walk directly back a couple of steps. And often, she will have run straight away from you and from the nest and then flushed up. And so you can backtrack her steps a little bit, and sometimes you can find the nest there. Now, I've said all of that about finding nests, but it's really critically important that you avoid disturbing the birds at all costs. Yes, finding nests is wonderful. It's great, but the birds come first. So to make sure that you minimize your impact on them, you want to observe them from a distance whenever possible. With binoculars is best. You don't want to flush the adult if you've got one sitting on a nest. In the early stages of incubation, but especially the early stages of nest building, birds will abandon their nests really quickly. They don't have a lot of investment in them yet, and so if they think that their site has been discovered, they'll abandon and move somewhere else. So if you're following birds early on in the nesting stages, birds that are carrying nesting material, that kind of thing, you want to give them their space. You don't want to be too close. 30 or 40 feet is a comfortable distance. You also don't want to approach a nest at all if it's got older nestlings, because you coming up, they think you're a predator and they may jump out of the nest and fledge early, and that dramatically decreases their success. When you're out looking for nests, keep an eye out for predators like crows or jays. This red squirrel, you can see there's blood on his face. He just had a meal of a nest. Cowbirds as well. They're always watching and are quite good at realizing what you're up to. And if it's never a bad idea. You should always just assume that something's watching, but especially if you do think that maybe, oh man, I didn't see that crow up there. You can just kind of go to the next shrub and do what you just did, look in it for a nest. You can check to see if it's in there. Do that 1 or 2 times. That can help. But don't linger when you're at a nest. Be very quick, just a couple of minutes. It's all, any more than that is excessive. And avoid trampling vegetation, and don't double back if you can. Go to a nest and then keep on moving forward. Predators will often follow a scent trail, and a dead end is a good indication of something that they should check out. And so that'll often lead them to investigate a place more closely and find the nest. So you found a nest. What sort of information should you include? You can use the comments section of your eBird checklist. Include information about the general habitat and the nest substrate. Was it in a tree, a shrub? Was it on the ground? If it's nesting in a cavity, where on the tree and on the branch was the cavity? What orientation was it facing? How high was it? What were the adults up to? Were they incubating, feeding? And then the number of eggs and chicks, and especially cowbird eggs. The easiest way to confirm cowbirds in a block is to find an egg in a nest. And if you've done that, you've confirmed 2 species at once. So right now, this is a good time to start thinking about, especially this year, start thinking about some species that they have pretty short windows that are different from other species. So owls, they're tough to detect. Basically, the only time of year when you can get them is when they're calling, and that tends to be mid to late winter. It is perfectly acceptable for the Atlas to be using limited playback to detect owls. If you drive roads and you stop and you play some playback briefly, there's instructions on how to do this in the handbook. and you get a response to the playbook, or to the playback, that's good for code T. That's a territorial bird. They're responding to what they think is an intruder. So you should feel free to use code T on that. Vultures are everywhere, but they're so difficult to actually find breeding evidence for. One of the ways that researchers who study vultures find nest sites is to go out in about like February, early March. And they look for pairs of vultures that are perched overlooking potential nest sites. And the thinking is with vultures is that they sit there for a few weeks. They really like undisturbed sites for their nesting, and they will kind of use that scouting opportunity to decide whether it is undisturbed enough for them. So if you are out and about and you see a pair of vultures early in the season overlooking a potential nest site, that is an excellent time to use the pair code. And that is pretty much going to be the easiest way to find vulture breeding evidence in your block. It's a little bit early right now, but apparently woodcocks are displaying down in southern Maryland already. But pretty soon it'll be time to try and find woodcocks. They're displaying, so you can record that as code C, not as singing, but as a display. Okay, that is all that I've got to talk about. I would love to hear from you folks if there's anything that on your end that you think is missing from materials or resources, anything that is difficult to find, topics that need more explanations, anything like that. I'd love to hear from you, and if you don't want to speak up, you can feel free to email me about this as well. So I'll open it up, if that's all right with Scott and Evelyn, to comments and then questions. But before I do that, I just want to say thank you, especially to Emily and Karen for all of their work as county coordinators. Emily and Karen are the loveliest people to work with. I really enjoy whenever I get an email from them. And so huge thank you to them. And then of course to you Atlasers as well, 6,800 hours in the county from just shy of 300 of you. And in fact, it wasn't just the most hours in a county, it was also the highest number of hours per Atlaser. Works out to be about 25 hours per Atlaser, which is quite something. So that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very